It's Tuesday, September 23rd, 2025. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Granthermes. Today on the show, Donald Trump is ramping up his attacks against his political opponents by making more potentially illegal demands of his Justice Department and trying to create a new domestic terror group that would be a catchall for the people he doesn't like. And in doing this, I'm going to talk about why he might be showing his hand a little bit here. I'm also going to talk briefly about the latest news on Jimmy Kimmel's suspension and then unsuspension, because it does play into this new pressure campaign from the White House. But first, make sure you're subscribed or following the show on whatever podcast app you listen to it on. Like, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications if you're a watcher on YouTube. Sign up for Make It Make Sense on Substack. It is just $5 a month to become a paid subscriber, and you get access to all sorts of great bonus content there. And if not, no sweat, but please make sure you're sharing the show on social media. It's Mims News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod, all one word on every platform. I am at Granthermes on Twitter and Bluesky, and at Granthermes TV on everything else. All right, let's get to the show. I try hard on Make It Make Sense to give you a complete picture of the biggest stories, but I'm only one guy, and staying up to date with events around the world can be difficult for anyone when it's impossible to consult a single source for the full story. And with our social media algorithms sending us the versions of the news that only reinforce our own biases, it can be hard to know if you're actually informed, even for me. And that's why I've been using Ground News. Ground News is an app and a website that combines news from around the world all in one place, so you can compare coverage from every news source, and you can see if they have a political bias, how reliable their reporting is, and who owns them. My favorite feature is the blind spot feed. It highlights news disproportionately covered by one side or the other, so I can make sure I know how the news is being covered. It's like Make It Make Sense for Make It Make Sense. Right now, if you subscribe through my link in the show notes, you get 40% off the Vantage subscription. It's the one I use to get unlimited access to every feature, and it is just $60 for the entire year or $5 a month when you use that link. Your subscription helps Make It Make Sense, too. We get a cut of this subscription, but you're also helping Ground News make the news more transparent. Again, use the code in the show notes to get 40% off your Vantage subscription to Ground News. All right. Let's get back to the show. Over the last few days, there have been a few really big news stories that have dominated the headlines. The first is the funeral/memorial/fundraiser for Charlie Kirk, which you'll hear a little bit from in this episode, but I'm not going to cover that here. The other big headlines were ABC's suspension of Jimmy Kimmel and Trump seeming to accidentally make a private message to the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, a public one instead. Now, in case you didn't hear the news, last week Jimmy Kimmel was suspended from his late-night show after making fun of Trump for talking about construction of the new Mar-a-Lago-style White House ballroom instead of Charlie Kirk when he was asked about how he was grieving the loss of his friend. Now, Kimmel said that on Monday and was suspended on Wednesday after the FCC chairman, Brendan Carr, said this on a conservative podcast.
There's actions that we can take on licensed broadcasters. And frankly, I think that it's really sort of past time that a lot of these licensed broadcasters themselves push back on Comcast and Disney and say, listen, we are going to preempt. We are not going to run Kimmel anymore until you straighten this out, because we licensed broadcaster, are running the possibility of fines or license revocation from the FCC if we continue to run content that ends up being a pattern of news distortion. So I think, again, Disney needs to see some change here, but the individual licensed stations that are taking their content, it's time for them to step up and say, this, garbage, to the extent that that's what comes down the pipe in the future, isn't something that we think serves the needs of our local communities. But this sort of status quo is obviously not acceptable where we are.
So I'm going to get into what Carr said here in just a second. If you don't know what the FCC does, though, it controls certain parts of broadcast and media. Things like broadcast media, ABC, NBC, CBS, and Fox, your local Fox station, not Fox News, because cable is a different animal. The FCC controls more things like radio, a little less of social media. And that's a pretty explicit threat there to ABC from Carr. And after he said it, two of the largest media companies in the country, Nexstar and Sinclair, that together make up about 20% of all ABC stations in the country, said that they were going to preempt reruns of Kimmel's show, and then ABC suspended Kimmel. Now, it's pretty clear that the FCC doesn't have the legal power to do what Carr said he wants to do. The threshold for taking action on what's called news distortion is really, really high. And it means that there's evidence the FCC can prove that a news outlet purposefully distorts the news of a major event that goes beyond just being inaccurate about something or having a differing opinion on it. And as far as I can tell, it's never been used in the 50 years it's been a part of the FCC's playbook. It's also against the law, according to a unanimous ruling from the Supreme Court just last year that said the government can't use its authority to coerce companies into making decisions it wouldn't normally otherwise have made. And we know that that's the case at ABC because according to Rolling Stone and Puck News, ABC and even affiliate heads didn't see a problem with what Kimmel said, but were worried about backlash from the Trump administration. And it's clear that ABC, Disney, Nexstar, and Sinclair heard Carr's statement and then made that decision to fall in line in what was a really troubling anti-First Amendment stance. Now, Sinclair, which is a conservative company that forces its affiliate stations to air what are called must-run stories that are usually promoting MAGA talking points, they mention Carr's statement directly. In fact, going so far as to thank him for making the statement. Sinclair, by the way, is also looking at a merger with another media company, and Nexstar is in the middle of a major merger right now with another company called Tegna, which could give Nexstar control over channels in 80% of American homes, which is more than double the current limit allowed by the FCC. So it's not hard to see why these companies rolled over here. And then after that happened, Trump threatened NBC, telling them to fire Jimmy Fallon and Seth Meyers, who routinely make fun of him, again implying that the government could make doing business hard for NBC and its affiliates. Now, obviously, this was really concerning for its infringement of the First Amendment. And again, like I said last week, it's the exact thing that the MAGA movement has been saying for years, that the government is trying to censor voices. I mean, Elon Musk even said that comedy was illegal during last year's Conservative Political Action Committee. So to have the government outright threaten media companies this time around is some real hypocrisy there. Now, yesterday, ABC announced Jimmy Kimmel would be brought back on the air tonight, though Nexstar and Sinclair both said they would continue to not run his show, including in some major TV markets like Seattle. And again, those two companies both have business with the government and want to be on its good side, not unlike CBS earlier this year, which paid a $16 million settlement for a case that most legal experts said they would definitely have won, and then also agreeing to cancel The Late Show with Stephen Colbert before the FCC allowed their major merger to go through. So is letting Kimmel back on the air a step back from the brink of really trampling all over the First Amendment? Yeah. Does it mean that we're out of the woods when it comes to this thing? Probably not, because it gets us to the next part I want to talk about here, which is on Saturday, Trump sent out a message on Truth Social that was clearly meant to be a text or an email or a private message of some kind to the Attorney General, Pam Bondi. In it, he accused her of being all talk, no action, and then he explicitly named former FBI Director James Comey, California Senator Adam Schiff, and New York Attorney General Letitia James, saying they're all guilty as hell, but nothing is being done, saying that he wanted Bondi to go after them. He ended with saying, "We can't delay any longer. It's killing our reputation and credibility. They impeached me twice and indicted me 5 times over nothing. Justice must be served now." That last bit there was in all caps and ended with 3 exclamation points. Now, this is an explicit call from the president to his attorney general to go after his political opponents, not because they committed crimes, but because they're his opponents. It's something we haven't seen since the Nixon administration, when Nixon was caught on tape doing a similar thing with his Attorney General, John Mitchell, who ended up serving 19 months in prison for his crimes surrounding Watergate. And so far, here's how the White House responded when Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt was asked about this message.
I want to point to something that the president said during his inaugural address. Never again will the immense power of the state be weaponized to persecute political opponents. We will not allow that to happen. Is the president going back on his promise?
No. In fact, the president is fulfilling his promise to restore a Department of Justice that demands accountability. And it is not weaponizing the Department of Justice to demand accountability for those who weaponized the Department of Justice. And nobody knows what that looks like more than President Trump.
So let's talk about the gaslighting that Levitt is doing here while accusing other people of gaslighting, which is gaslighting in and of itself. But Trump was investigated after he left office by several Republican special counsels. One of those investigations was for taking hundreds of classified documents to his properties in Florida and New Jersey after explicitly defying a subpoena to return them to the National Archives. He was also investigated by the Department of Justice for attempting to overturn the 2020 election and inciting a riot at the Capitol on January 6th, which was an attack on the Capitol and the lives of American leaders, and was being investigated for those reasons. And then a bipartisan congressional committee found he did, in fact, sow the seeds that led to January 6th for months beforehand and the day of January 6th. Neither of those cases, however, actually went any further than the investigations themselves because they were slow-walked by Biden's attorney general, who was a Democrat, and then halted by Trump's DOJ. And the weaponization of the Department of Justice they're talking about just isn't real. There was real evidence of real crimes, and it's the DOJ's job to investigate those things no matter who commits them. And the same goes for New York's Attorney General Letitia James. Here's how Caroline Levitt talked about her.
So why won't the president accept the conclusions of his Justice Department to not bring charges against Letitia James? In fact, you had Bondi and Blanche top DOJ leadership who were against ousting Eric Siebert, who again was picked by President Trump.
I just answered that question for you, and the president has every right to express how he feels about these people who literally campaigned on trying to put him in jail, who literally tried to ruin his life and ruin his businesses, and he wants to see accountability for those who abuse their office and abuse their power, and Letitia James absolutely did.
So obviously the irony here is that Trump is trying to get Pam Bondi to abuse her power as AG to go after Trump's opponents, but word choice is really important here. They keep calling for accountability. That's not the same thing as justice. Justice would mean the DOJ investigated and found evidence to indict someone like Letitia James and would then refer that to prosecutors, and it would go through the justice system. The Department of Justice under Trump this time around didn't find any reason to do that. And that's not what's happening here either. What Trump wants is retribution, and he's calling that accountability. He wants people to be, quote, held to account for the things that they did in the course of following the law and their jobs in the past. He wants them to be humiliated and beaten, and he wants that implicit threat to be something that will mean his political enemies will stop their work against him on their own, the same way that ABC, Nexstar, and Sinclair made private decisions based on pressure from the FCC. Now, that being said, Trump also moved this week to create a new domestic terror organization in the U.S. by trying to call Antifa a new terror group and ordered all the executive agencies to start treating Antifa groups or linked groups as such. And if you don't know what Antifa is, it's short for anti-fascist. And I'm going to leave the mental gymnastics of trying to figure out what it means to be anti-fascist to you, but there are a few major problems with this designation. The first is the president can't actually designate a domestic terror organization. There's no law on the books that lets him do it. He can write an executive order or a proclamation doing that, but that doesn't make it law. What he can do by law is designate foreign terror groups, but just not domestic ones, largely because it's a slippery slope, one we're currently definitely on, to infringing on the First Amendment rights of freedom of speech, association, and assembly. Second, Antifa isn't an organization. By Trump's own Department of Justice and FBI definitions, it's a movement or an ideology. It would be like trying to classify MAGA as an organization. It's just not. So what it does mean is it makes Antifa this catch-all name for the kinds of people that Trump doesn't like. Say, the left, who Trump wrongly says is responsible for most of the political violence in the country, or Democratic donors, or those people he wants the Attorney General to go after, or trans people, whom he was asked about on Air Force One this week.
Charlie's killer lives with a guy who's transgender. The Annunciation shooter was transgender. The Covenant shooter was transgender. Should the FBI be investigating transgender extremism?
We're looking at that, and it seems like, is that just what's the reason for it?
And it's worth pointing out here that right now we don't know if Charlie Kirk's accused shooter was left-wing or held left-wing views. His roommate, possibly his significant other, depending on the reporting you're reading, has been very cooperative with the FBI. And so far, there's been no connection between left-wing groups and the accused killer. But Trump is going to use this as a pretext to go after groups of Americans he doesn't like. And in fact, it's more than that. He doesn't like them. Here's how he described his political opponents at Charlie Kirk's memorial/MAGA rally this weekend.
He wanted the best for them. That's where I disagreed with Charlie. I hate my opponent, and I don't want the best for them. I'm sorry. I am sorry, Erica. But now Erica can talk to me and the whole group, and maybe they can convince me that that's not right, but I can't stand my opponent.
So, Trump saying he hates tens of millions of Americans and wants the worst for them is a hell of a thing to hear from a president, especially one looking to criminalize what those people believe. But there is one more thing here, and it's an important piece from that message that Trump sent to Bondi that I talked about earlier. It's when he said, "We can't delay any longer, it's killing our reputation and credibility," and it seems to say that Trump knows his political clock is ticking here. Public support for Trump continues to drop. The latest polls show Trump's approval ratings at around 41%, essentially as low as he can go in our current political world. 60% of Americans said the country is on the wrong track, and 50% of likely voters said if the midterm elections were held today, they'd be voting for a Democrat. Now, when it comes to Trump specifically, 2/3 of Americans disapprove of how he's handled prices and inflation, the thing he ran on and won on in 2024 by promising to lower grocery store prices, which are up 30% since 2020 and nearly 3% since last year. 60% disapprove of how he's handled healthcare and trade, and around half of all Americans disapprove of how he's handled immigration, deportations, crime, and jobs. In fact, the only thing that he's above 50% on is border security, and that's at 52%. We're also a week away from another government shutdown, something I'll be talking about on Thursday's episode. And Trump wants support for his policies while also being able to blame Democrats for a shutdown should it happen. And while we're more than a year out for the 2026 midterms, those races have already started, and fundraising is about to kick into high gear. So all of this is to say is Trump is using his office and wants to use his Department of Justice to target major Democratic donors who, if they were under threat of investigation or indictment for, say, Antifa activities or for accountability, they might not give as much money. Left-leaning organizations might not do as much work in drumming up support for their policies or their candidates, and major media organizations may struggle to point out inaccuracies from the White House, scandals in the administration, or outright illegal activity, all at a time when it's convenient for Trump and Republicans ahead of some key political moments. And it's really important that right now we keep our eye on that particular ball. Okay, that is it for today's episode. Please rate and review the show on whatever podcast app you listen to it on. Like, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, and leave a comment below if you're a watcher on YouTube. Sign up for the Make It Make Sense Substack. It is just $5 a month. And as always, share the show on social media. It's Mims Newspod. That's MIMS Newspod, all one word on every platform. I am at Granthermes on X and Bluesky, and at Granthermes TV on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Granthermes, and I'll talk to you on Thursday.